Traveling through history, the show that uncovers the past mysteries. Washington, Jefferson, Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, or the independence of the states.
Welcome to another episode of Traveling Through History. Really happy you're with us tonight. Tonight we're going to do a follow-up episode to one we did about a month ago on the history of Jesus Christ, the most consequential human that ever lived. And tonight we're going to look at his apostles, his disciples, the women who followed him, and the apostles that ended up becoming saints in Christian lore. And we're going to take a look at each of the individual people in that line and the people that helped him build his church, build his following, write the books that are the New Testament, and do many, many consequential things in the early days of the Christian faith to really make a humongous impact on Israel and all the surrounding areas around there. We even had Paul and others traveling to Asia and really far ends of the earth at the time, trying to spread the message of Jesus. And so today we're going to just look at the history of each of these individuals, what they did, who they were, where they came from, what their impact was on the history of Christianity, some of the history coming out of the Bible and some from other sources. So tonight we'll get into each of them. We'll also talk a little bit about the New Testament, some of the major books there and who wrote what. And we're going to get into a little bit of some of the horrific deaths that these apostles and these early disciples suffered for their faith, defending their faith and following Jesus Christ, doing so very much at their own peril. It was very much against your personal health to follow him at the time, because politically Jesus was a pariah when it came to the early Jewish church and obviously the Roman individuals who were running the different governing areas that he was impacting. And so it took a lot of bravery to do what the disciples and the apostles and the women who followed him did, which was to not only follow him, but to then spread the word and create additional and new disciples. So we're going to get into the history of each of these individuals and take a look at them right now. So let's go ahead and get into it. So this is the apostles, saints, disciples, and women who followed Jesus. You see some fantastic pictures here. The one to the top left there are the major four books coming out of the Gospels in the New Testament. That's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All those individuals being very important people and leaders in the early church. You can see probably the most famous painting ever of Jesus and his apostles, which was at the Last Supper. So that was done by Da Vinci, and it's a very incredibly famous painting and very impactful in Christian history and in Christian lore. And you see down at the bottom left, Jesus leading his apostles and disciples with him, going from town to town to speak to the people. You can see another picture in the middle there of the 12 apostles. These are the 12 initial disciples that got converted to apostles by Jesus. Each of them were chosen individually for different reasons, but they were chosen as apostles because they had missions that Jesus wanted them to fulfill on behalf of the church. And another great picture there at the bottom right of Jesus with his apostles, giving them the lesson of the day and then eventually giving them instructions. So what is an apostle versus a disciple? The terms get thrown around very easily back and forth. A lot of people interchange them. They really are a different thing. A disciple is a student or a follower of a teacher. So the Jesus disciples were followers or students of Jesus, while an apostle is a messenger specifically sent out with a mission by that teacher, sent out to do something, either to preach or to convert people or to help or create ministry. So you can see the difference here between disciple and apostle. Apostle is actually a disciple, but it's a very special one because it's given a mission by the teacher. In this case, Jesus gave each of these 12 apostles a special mission. Therefore, while every apostle is a disciple, not every disciple is an apostle. Jesus had many disciples, but chose a select few, the 12 original disciples, and then later some others like Paul, to be apostles to specifically spread his message and establish the early church. Apostle comes from the Greek word meaning to be sent. So that makes sense. If apostle is a missionary with a mission, then they're being sent, and that's the Greek word for that. Disciple comes from the Greek word meaning to follow. So again, really important to distinguish between a disciple and apostle. They're a very different thing. You can see down below the meaning for disciple is learner or student. The role is to follow, learn from, and imitate a teacher. The relationship is to Jesus. Anyone who followed Jesus and his teachings were all disciples. The key qualification is believe in and follow Jesus. That's all you have to do to be a disciple. To be an apostle, this is an individual who gets sent out, or a messenger, or somebody who has a mission, or a missionary. The role is somebody who's commissioned by Jesus or the church to spread the teacher's message and to establish a foundation. The relationship to Jesus is a very special one, a personal one. It was a chosen group. And of course, these 12 first apostles were those first chosen from his discipleship. Key qualification is that you have to personally witness Jesus' ministry, his resurrection, his miracles. And essentially, they were sent by him out into the communities to spread the teachings and the word. So that's really what apostles did. So they had that special relationship with Jesus and his church. So let's talk about the 12 apostles. These were those 12 first chosen by Jesus from his disciples to become apostles. The first one is Peter, or Simon Peter. This is one of the first individuals he chose in the Bible, and he was a fisherman. We'll get into a little bit more of his story. Philip was the next one. Then James the Greater, one of the two James in the group. We'll talk about James the Greater in a minute. Andrew, Bartholomew, Simon, James, and that was the James who was the brother of Jesus, and we'll talk about him as well. Matthew, Thaddeus, John, Thomas, and Judas. So those were the 12 initial apostles who got chosen by Jesus to help him establish the church. And we'll get into all of those right now. So let's start with Andrew. St. Andrew, the apostle, was a Galilean fisherman, the brother of Simon Peter, and was an early disciple of John the Baptist before Jesus called him to be one of the 12 apostles. So really interesting that he was one of those individuals who was getting baptized in the river by John the Baptist, did not know Jesus, but then, of course, came upon him when Jesus went to get baptized as well. Known as the first called, so he was the first apostle. Andrew played a relatively minor role in the Gospels, but was instrumental in bringing his brother Simon Peter to Jesus and was present at major events in Christ's ministry. Andrew was a close companion of Jesus, witnessing his miracles and his teachings, including the feeding of the 5,000, where he pointed out the boy with the loaves and fish. He was also one of the 4 disciples who asked Jesus about the signs of his return on Mount Olives. After Christ's death, he evangelized in the Black Sea region, founded the church in Byzantium, and was martyred by crucifixion on an X-shaped cross in Patras, Greece. He's the patron saint of Scotland, Russia, and other countries, with his saltire cross famously featured on the Scottish flag. You can see a picture down at the bottom there, that X cross that he was crucified on for following Jesus. And you can see another picture in the middle there where he was carrying the actual cross itself. Some really great pictures there of what Andrew would have looked like and what the depiction of him is. So you can see he was one of the apostles that was martyred because of his following of Jesus. Let's talk about Peter. So in Luke 5, Jesus uses Simon Peter's boat to preach and then performs a miracle by telling Peter to cast his net out for a catch of fish, resulting in a miraculous amount of fish that fills 2 boats. This leads Peter to realize Jesus' divine nature, and he leaves his fishing career to follow Jesus as a fisher of men. So you'll hear that term all the time about Peter, that he was an ex-fisherman, yes, but then he became a fisher of men after following Jesus. Peter was originally named Simon, a Galilean Jewish fisherman who, along with his brother Andrew, became one of Jesus' first and most prominent apostles. After witnessing Jesus' miracles and declaring him the Messiah, Jesus renamed him Peter, meaning rock. Following Jesus' death, Peter became a leader in the early church, preaching at Pentecost and spreading the gospel to Jews, Samaritans, and Gentiles. He was martyred in Rome around 64 AD, and he was crucified upside down because he refused to be killed the same way Jesus was. So he said, if I'm going to be crucified, I want to be upside down. He is a significant figure in Christianity and one of the early saints. You see some great pictures there of him pulling up the catch that Jesus told him to cast out for, and then some other depictions of Peter there on the Sea of Galilee. One of the famous passages in the Gospel of Matthew is where Jesus identifies Peter as the foundation of his church. You are Christ, the Son of the living God. In Matthew it says, I will tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. So you can see he really looked at Peter as the cornerstone of the Christian church. So next is Philip. Apostle Philip was a Galilean from Bethsaida, which is the same town that Peter and Andrew were from. And he was called by Jesus to be one of the 12 apostles as well. Philip the apostle was one of Jesus' original 12 apostles, called from Bethsaida and known for telling his friend Nathanael to come and see. That was from John 1:43 to 46. He appears in the Gospel of John asking Jesus to show them the Father. And in the book of Acts, he appears as one of the 7 deacons appointed to serve the early church. Tradition holds that after ascension, Philip preached the gospel in Asia Minor. So he was one of the apostles that went very much east to go preach to other populations. He eventually became martyred also by crucifixion in Hierapolis around 80 AD. He was a very old man when he was crucified as well. So among all the apostles who had a very horrible ending in death because of their following of Jesus, he was also one of them. See a great picture there at the top of him as he went east and met with many, many different populations. And then, of course, a great picture there to the top of him with the boy with the fish and the bread. So that was Apostle Philip. Next one was John. Apostle John, who was the son of Zebedee and brother of the Apostle James the Greater, was a Jewish fisherman from Galilee who became one of Jesus' 12 apostles, part of his inner circle. Known as the beloved disciple, he was present at crucial events, including the Transfiguration and the Last Supper, and is credited by tradition with authoring the Gospel of John. He also authored the 3 epistles and the book of Revelation. After Jesus' death, John continued his leadership role in the early church. John was arrested in Ephesus and faced martyrdom when his enemies threw him in a huge basin of boiling oil. So they actually tried to kill him. However, according to tradition, John was miraculously delivered from death and saved. The authorities then sentenced John to slave labor in the mines of Patmos. On this island in the southern part of the Aegean Sea, John had a vision of Jesus Christ and wrote the prophetic book, Revelations. The Apostle John was later freed, possibly due to old age, and he returned to what is now Turkey. He died as an old man sometime around AD 98. He was the only apostle to die of peaceful means or of natural causes. It's really interesting that John made it all the way through his life and died at 98 years old and did all these great things, not only following Jesus, but helping him establish the church, writing all these great books, including the Gospel of John, and then all the way to the end of his life, going through many horrible things, and had really a consequential run, as you can see. So next is James the Greater. This is the first James. He was the brother of the Apostle John, and both were fishermen called by Jesus while by the Sea of Galilee. Jesus allowed James, John, and Peter to be present at significant events, such as the Transfiguration and the resurrection of Jairus' daughter. He was the brother of John the Apostle, the son of Zebedee and Salome. and known as one of the sons of thunder. That's what they call these two brothers. After Jesus' resurrection, James preached in Israel and Spain before returning to Judea. James is the only apostle whose martyrdom is recorded in the New Testament, where King Herod Agrippa said, I had him beheaded with a sword. So that's how he ended up dying, was being beheaded with a sword. This is thought to have happened around 44 AD. His remains were eventually taken to Compostela, which is in Spain, which became a major pilgrimage site for Christians, and he is venerated as the patron saint of Spain and pilgrims. So you can see a couple of really great depictions there of John and his followings and teachings of Jesus. So next one is the other James, the Just, James the Just. He was the brother of Jesus Christ and a key leader in the early Jerusalem church, revered for his devotion to Jewish law and the teachings of his brother Jesus. He became a bishop in Jerusalem, and after an initial period of doubt, devoted his life to Christ, receiving a personal appearance from the resurrected Jesus. His ministry focused on maintaining the Jewish character of the Jesus movement and emphasizing that the faith must be accompanied by good works. He was martyred in 62 AD by Jewish authorities in Jerusalem, who condemned him for breaking Jewish law, an event viewed by many citizens as politically motivated murder. James sought to preserve the Jesus movement as an authentic expression of Judaism. He emphasized that true faith is inseparable from good deeds, teaching that faith without works is dead. So that, as you know, there's several different denominations of Christianity, some of whom think that good works are necessary to get to heaven, and other denominations believe that is not true. All you need is just the forgiveness of Jesus and of God. It's really interesting that Jesus' brother played such a substantial role in the early church. You can see he really did have a big impact, especially in the Jerusalem region. So next is Matthew, the Apostle Matthew. He was a Jewish tax collector, also known as Levi, early in his life. And he was doing that tax collecting for the Roman Empire. And he was called by Jesus to follow him and become one of the 12 apostles, according to the New Testament. So he had a very different background than most of the other apostles who were fishermen. He's traditionally credited with writing the Gospel of Matthew, a book of the Christian Bible that details Jesus' life and teachings with an emphasis on his humanity and lineage. After Jesus' ascension, Matthew served as a missionary, traveling to places like Ethiopia and Parthia. The traditional Christian account holds that the Apostle Matthew died as a martyr as well in Ethiopia, and he was killed by King Artaxerxes and his order after Matthew rebuked the king for lusting after a nun. The story states the enraged king had the swordsman kill Matthew while he was at the altar. So he was literally in the middle of preaching when he got killed by the king's men. This event, known as the martyrdom of St. Matthew, is a subject depicted in art, such as Caravaggio's The Martyrdom of St. Matthew. And you see it there to the right, very, very famous painting in Christian history of Matthew getting struck down while he's preaching. It's really one of the most impactful and interesting and important of all the apostles. So next was Bartholomew. He was introduced to Jesus by Philip and was initially skeptical, famously questioning if anything good could come from Nazareth. However, after Jesus demonstrated his divine knowledge by recalling Bartholomew's prior location, Bartholomew's doubts vanished, and he recognized Jesus as the Son of God and King of Israel. The history of the Apostle Bartholomew, also known as Nathanael, details his calling by Jesus and subsequent missionary journeys across the East, including to India and Armenia. His life culminated in a brutal martyrdom in Armenia, where he was reportedly flayed alive and then beheaded for converting the Armenian king to Christianity. He is remembered as a witness to Christ's miracles, a devoted apostle, and a patron saint in various traditions, particularly for his connection to the Armenian Apostolic Church. So really pretty incredible. All these apostles, except for John, had these terrible deaths, all because of their faith and all because they were following Jesus and just trying to bring his word to people's lives. So next was Simon the Zealot. Apostle Simon, also known as Simon the Zealot, was one of the 12 apostles of Jesus, distinguished from Simon Peter, who we talked about earlier. His history is primarily known through non-biblical tradition, which describes him as a fervent follower of Christ, possibly a former revolutionary who evangelized in Egypt and Persia on behalf of Jesus' teachings. So you can just imagine he was one of those ones who went into primarily Muslim countries and was teaching them about Jesus and about his teachings. So he really was going kind of into a territory that was not very friendly. He's traditionally had believed to have been martyred, with some accounts suggesting crucifixion or potentially being cut in half, though the specifics of his death, preaching locations, and burial place are debated even today. His designation as the Zealot likely distinguished him from Simon Peter and referred to his fervent zeal for Christ rather than membership in a militant zealot political party. He is said to have traveled and preached in Egypt and later with the Apostle Jude in Persia, and he spent about half as much time in both places. It's a really interesting story there about Simon the Zealot. So next was Thaddeus. The Apostle Thaddeus, also known as Jude, was one of the 12 apostles, though the name Thaddeus may also refer to another figure, Thaddeus of Edessa, one of the 70 disciples of Jesus. The two figures are sometimes conflated, but they were different people. And the conflation leads to different traditions and accounts of their lives and missions. So you have to be really careful if you're talking about Thaddeus the apostle or Thaddeus the disciple. The apostle Thaddeus is known for writing the Epistle of Jude and is venerated as a saint. He preached the gospel in the Middle East, including Judea, Samaria, and Mesopotamia. He's often considered the patron saint of lost causes and hopeless situations. He was martyred around 65 AD in Persia or Syria. He was beaten to death with a club and an axe due to his Christian faith. It's really a horrible death, just like the others. His remains were later moved to Rome and are now interred in a tomb with Saint Simon the Zealot beneath the St. Peter's Basilica. So pretty interesting that there in Rome at the Vatican, you have several of these great saints that were apostles of Jesus. So next is Thomas, the Apostle Thomas, who was one of Jesus's original 12 disciples. He was known for his initial doubt, so they call him Doubting Thomas, about the resurrection and his later staunch faith. He's the most famous for insisting on touching Jesus's wounds to confirm the resurrection after his crucifixion, and that earned him the nickname Doubting Thomas. Upon seeing the resurrected Jesus, Thomas's doubt was replaced with firm belief, and he uttered the profound statement, "My Lord and my God." After Jesus' resurrection, Thomas is traditionally said to have traveled to India as a missionary around 52 AD. He's believed to have spread the gospel, faced opposition, and was eventually martyred for his faith in India. Thomas was killed with a spear at St. Thomas Mount in Chennai in July 72 AD. So he had been there for 20 years. His body was interred in a Millipore tomb in India. The Acts of Thomas, this early Christian text, further details his missionary journey to India and his interactions with King Gundaforus. His story is one of transformation from doubt to unwavering belief and selfless dedication. So that's really the story of Thomas, is that his doubt was turned by Jesus and then became one of his great apostles and one of the people that spread his word all around the eastern part of the world at the time. So a great picture there, Thomas reaching to touch Jesus's wounds when he was resurrected. So next apostle is Judas. Judas Iscariot was a member of Jesus's 12 apostles, and he was a non-Galilean disciple from Kerioth, which is a town in Judea. So he was one of the few disciples and eventually apostles to come from outside Galilee. Judas is primarily known for betraying Jesus to the authorities for 30 pieces of silver, leading to Jesus' crucifixion. Before his betrayal, Judas served as the disciples' treasurer, but also stole from the money bag, a sign of his greed and dishonesty. Judas may have become disillusioned with Jesus' lack of political ambition and focus on spiritual matters rather than being a military messiah. Judas arranged with the high priest to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. He identified Jesus to an armed guard in the Garden of Gethsemane with a kiss, which led to Jesus' arrest. The other disciples were unaware of his intentions and initially thought he was on an errand. After Jesus' arrest, Judas, filled with remorse, returned the money and then committed suicide by hanging himself. He just couldn't live with what he had done. You see a picture there in the Garden of Gethsemane up at the top, and then a picture of Judas with the 30 pieces of silver in his hands, and then eventually he gave it up and committed suicide. So next apostle is Paul, the most famous apostle who is not part of the original 12. So he was named later by Jesus, and that was Paul the apostle. He's widely considered one of the most famous and influential apostles for his extensive missionary journeys and his prolific writings that form a significant portion of the New Testament. Born Saul of Tarsus, he was a crucial figure in spreading Christianity throughout the Roman Empire, establishing Christian communities in Asia Minor and Europe in the 1st century AD. Paul undertook extensive journeys to spread the teachings of Jesus, founding numerous churches in regions like Asia Minor and Europe. His letters or epistles make up a large part of the New Testament and are foundational to Christian theology. He's often called the apostle to the Gentiles because of his role in spreading Christianity to non-Jewish people. He was originally a persecutor of Christians before converting to Christianity, a transformative event that marked the beginning of his life's work for the faith. The Bible describes Jesus appearing to Paul on the road to Damascus and appointing him as an apostle, specifically to bring Jesus' name to the Gentiles, to kings, and to the people of Israel. He was a highly venerated figure across all of Christian denominations that recognize saints. You see a great picture there at the top of Paul preaching to the people. He would get really big crowds everywhere he went. Not quite as big as Jesus, but pretty close. And they knew that he was there on behalf of Jesus. So really pretty incredible, the impact that Paul had, both his preaching at the time, his pulling together of churches on behalf of the early Christian faith, and then very importantly, all the writings he has in his letters that made up much of the New Testament. So another person we need to talk about is Stephen. He was not one of the apostles. He was a disciple, but he was the first martyr considered in Christianity for dying for his faith, even before any of the apostles did. Stephen was not a direct disciple of Jesus, but he was one of the first 7 deacons of the early church, and he was appointed by the apostles to help serve the community. He was known for being a man of full faith and Holy Spirit who preached powerfully about Jesus. Stephen's ministry provoked religious leaders who accused him of blasphemy and had him stoned to death, making him the first Christian martyr. Stephen was chosen as one of the first deacons to oversee the distribution of food to the needy, which allowed the apostles to then focus on prayer and preaching. His boldness in his own preaching led to his arrest and a trial before the Sanhedrin. He was falsely accused of speaking blasphemy against Moses and God. During his defense speech, Stephen eloquently recounted the history of Israel's rejection of God's messengers, which then enraged the crowd. He was then dragged out of the city and stoned to death, becoming the first martyr for his Christian faith. As he was being stoned, Stephen's final words were, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit, and Lord, do not hold this sin against them." So you can see he said very similar words to what Jesus said when he was on the cross. Some great pictures there to the right of Stephen as he was preaching to people, and then during his trial, and then, of course, the actual stoning itself, which was a horrific event. So let's talk about the actual Gospels in the Bible itself. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the individuals who wrote that make up the Gospels. The history of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is rooted in early Christian tradition that attributes their authorship to specific individuals. Matthew, the tax collector and apostle; Mark, an associate of Peter; Luke, a companion of Paul and a physician; and John, the disciple and the apostle. These four books form the basis of the New Testament story of Jesus' life and teachings. Mark's gospel is considered the earliest gospel and a source for the others. The gospel's differing perspectives, writing styles, and content were shaped by their varied intended audiences and the author's different backgrounds and experiences with early Christian communities. The variations are seen as different pieces of the puzzle, each gospel offering a unique perspective that enriches the overall story of Jesus, so all of them must be read in a larger context, one after the other. That's really how they were written. So very interesting history there around the four Gospels and why they're so important and why they're really the foundation of the New Testament. Let's talk about the Last Supper, that event we mentioned earlier. It refers to both the final meal that Jesus shared with his apostles before his crucifixion, during which he instituted the Eucharist, told Judas he would betray him, and it also represents Leonardo da Vinci's famous mural depicting this event, as you see there in the bottom. The biblical meal is a foundational event in Christianity, commemorated on Holy Thursday, and symbolizes Jesus' sacrifice and creation of the new covenant. Da Vinci's painting, located currently in Milan, is a masterful example of perspective and crucial work of art. Jesus announced one of his disciples would betray him, identifying Judas Iscariot as the traitor, and foretold Peter's denial of him. Judas's betrayal is understood to be motivated by Satan's influence and his own prior dishonesty with the common purse, leading to his arrangement with the priest for 30 pieces of silver. See some great passages from the Bible here that talk about this event. Matthew 26 through 29 describes Jesus giving his disciples the bread and the wine, stating, "Take, eat, this is my body, this is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Then in Mark 14, records Jesus saying, "This is my body, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." Then finally in Luke 22, quotes Jesus giving instructions, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And this cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." So you can see very different writing styles in all these different books, but really the message is the same. They're recording the same event, which was the Last Supper he had with his apostles. Let's talk about some of the women disciples of Jesus. You had Saint Fotini, you had Saint Melania, Saint Eudoxia, Saint Pelagia, Saint Macrina, Saint Mary of Egypt, Saint Mary Magdalene, who you also see him depicted there to the left with Saint Mary Magdalene, and also Saint Mary of Mesopotamia. So you can see out of these 8 primary saints of the women that followed him, 3 were named Mary. So very interesting there. So Mary, his mother, was the first century Jewish woman, mother of Jesus, who's central to Christianity, Catholicism, and other faiths, and was venerated in the early church and through the Middle Ages as Mary, the Mother of God. She is known from the Bible as the Virgin Mother of Jesus. She is known from the Bible as the Virgin Mother of Jesus, who miraculously conceived him through the Holy Spirit. She endured challenges, including potential shame for a betrothed woman's pregnancy, witnessed Jesus' birth, ministry, and his crucifixion. Mary was present at Jesus' circumcision and the presentation in the temple, where Simeon foretold his future and Mary's pain. She also worried when Jesus was lost in the temple at age 12 for 3 days. Mary was present at the crucifixion as well, fulfilling Simeon's prophecy. Jesus entrusted the care of his mother to the Apostle John at his death. The Roman Catholic Church teaches the doctrine of the Assumption of Mary, which states that Mary was taken up, body and soul, into heavenly glory at the end of her earthly life. Mary was entrusted to St. John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, and lived with him in Jerusalem and then in Ephesus in modern-day Turkey until she died of natural causes. It's really interesting that he tapped John to be the one to look after his mother after Jesus passed. Some great pictures there of Mary with the baby Jesus, and then, of course, Mary being one of the women that attended his crucifixion. Mary Magdalene was a significant follower of Jesus who was healed from 7 demons by Jesus and then supported his ministry financially and was present at his crucifixion and resurrection, being the first to witness his appearance after rising from the dead. While Gospels provide few details about her, centuries of Western Christian tradition and art mistakenly portrayed her as a prostitute, which has now been debunked. Her historical importance is as a devoted disciple and a primary witness to Jesus' resurrection and pivotal figure in the early church. Along with other women, she provided financial support for Jesus and his disciples, indicating she had some financial resources. Her name Magdalene comes from her hometown of Magdala, a fishing town on the Sea of Galilee. She was the first person to tell male disciples that Jesus had risen from the dead, leading to her being known as the Apostle of Apostles. You see some great pictures of Jesus and Mary Magdalene there when he appears to her after his being risen from the dead. And she was also later sainted. And so she is considered a saint. Witnesses to Jesus, some of the witnesses to his resurrection include Mary Magdalene that we just mentioned, and other women at the tomb. The Apostle Peter, also he appeared to. The disciples on the road to Emmaus. The apostles in Jerusalem, he appeared to all of them together, including doubting Thomas. A large group of over 500 people, with the Apostle Paul claiming most of these witnesses were still alive when he wrote about it. Also, as we mentioned earlier, he also appeared to his brother James, and they had a conversation. These accounts are all detailed in the 4 Gospels and Paul's writings, with Paul providing an early Christian creed mentioning these important appearances. Paul also mentions James as a witness to the resurrected Jesus. It's really interesting there that after the resurrection, he came and appeared to these very chosen people. It seemed very deliberate who he came to. Let's talk about some of the quotes of the apostles. For when I am powerless, it is then I am strong. That's from Paul the apostle. God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God and God in him. That's from John the apostle. God loves us beyond comprehension, and we cannot diminish God's love for us. That's from St. Peter. Humility, which is a virtue, is always fruitful in good works. That's from Thomas. We walk by faith, not by sight. That's Paul the apostle. Love your enemies, bless them, and curse you. Do good to them and that they hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. And that was Matthew who said that. Nathanael answered him, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. It's really interesting that Nathanael said that, and that's detailed in the Bible in John 1:49. Have gentle utterances that will inspire a superior longing for all time. That's Philip. We also rejoice in our sufferings because we know the suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance produces character. Character produces hope. And hope does not disappoint us because God has poured out his love into our hearts by the Holy Spirit, whom he has given us. And that's Paul who said that. So that should give you a really good summation of who all the apostles were, the key disciples, the women who followed Jesus, the apostles who became saints, how they died, most of them very horrifically, except for John. It gives you a really good foundation of the history behind each of these very important individuals in the early church of Jesus Christ. Let's go ahead and take a look at a couple short videos. We'll come back and talk about it on the other side.
Did you know that although Peter is considered the first pope in the Catholic Church, he was not the first apostle? Christianity remains the most popular religion today, so it may seem difficult to believe it started with Jesus and only a few disciples. A disciple is anyone who believes in Jesus. During Jesus' travels, some of his disciples even followed him on his travels. Jesus picked 12 apostles out of those disciples as listed in the biblical books Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The information we know about each of these 12 men varies vastly. Some of them were so well known they even wrote books in the New Testament. Others don't have much more than their name mentioned in passing. Despite this disparity and confusion, the 12 apostles are vital to Christianity. By looking at each of them, we can learn more about how they shaped this world religion and continue to influence us today. Number 1. Peter. Peter is one of the most famous apostles and was, according to some denominations, the first pope. Experts are unsure when he was born, but they believe his birth name was Simon. He first appears in the Bible near the Sea of Galilee, around the lake of Gennesaret, when Jesus calls him and Andrew to become disciples. Some scholars believe Peter and Andrew may not have been doing the fishing themselves. Instead, they may have managed a small business and used hired workers. Although the Bible does not disclose many details about his personal life, Peter does appear repeatedly, often as the spokesperson for the apostles. This does not always portray him positively, and he is most remembered for denying Jesus 3 times on the night of Jesus' arrest, even though the text also showed Jesus accepting him. Peter was active in the early church after Jesus ascended to heaven, allegedly writing the 1st and 2nd Peter and several apocryphal books. Christian tradition states Peter died in Rome around 64 CE. He was crucified upside down because he didn't feel worthy enough to die in the same manner as Jesus. Since his death, Peter continues to impact Christianity. He is often depicted holding the keys to heaven, based on one of Jesus' statements about him. Whether or not Jesus intended to give him literal keys, Peter was one of the apostolic leaders, asking questions and leading the way for the new religion. Number 2. Andrew. Andrew was Peter's brother, but although Peter became the apostles' leader, Andrew is traditionally the first called apostle, earning him the nickname Protoclete. In the Gospel of John, Andrew was originally one of John the Baptist's disciples. When he heard about Jesus, he left John the Baptist and began following Jesus. Then he convinced his brother to meet Jesus, who came and eventually began following Jesus himself. However, besides this story, we don't have much information on Andrew in the biblical texts. He is mentioned several times as part of the group and helps with the miracle of feeding a large group of people. However, Andrew is more prominent in apocryphal works and Christian tradition. Some stories are fantastical, but most of his more probable tales center around Andrew's travels. He reportedly traveled to modern-day Poland, Iran, Scotland, Russia, and Turkey. Tradition states Andrew was also crucified, but he requested an X-shaped cross, which eventually became known as St. Andrew's Cross. It is often depicted with him in artwork. Number 3. James the Greater. There are several men named James in the New Testament, but James the Greater is almost always noted as the son of Zebedee. James was also the brother of John, and together they were nicknamed the Sons of Thunder. Although James is mentioned quite a bit in the Gospels, he does not say much. Some scholars believe he was part of Jesus' inner circle, which consisted of Peter, James, and John. These men saw the Transfiguration and were with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane before he was arrested. James is mentioned after Jesus ascended in the book of Acts. This biblical text discusses what the apostles and disciples did to start Christianity. In chapter 12, King Herod Agrippa orders James's beheading with a sword. This places his death in the early 40s CE, making James one of the first apostles to be martyred. However, some Christian traditions state James traveled to Spain to preach the gospel. While this does not coincide with historical or biblical evidence, James still left a lasting impact on Spain, even if he never actually visited. Number 4. John. John was the other son of Zebedee. While his brother was one of the first Christian martyrs, John wrote 2 of the most famous books in the Bible, the Gospel of John, and the Revelation of John. Experts also believe he wrote the 3 letters of John, but those books are not as well known today. The Gospel of John differs from the other 3 Gospels, and some historians think it was written later in his life. John's Gospel is more thematic than the others, reading more like a story than a preaching aid. He also includes more historical details to help people better understand the places and circumstances of each moment. The Revelation of John discusses the apocalypse with symbolism and allegory, which is one reason it remains popular today. While it is the only apocalyptic book in the New Testament, it wasn't alone. Several other contemporary works were attributed to John, although they did not join the biblical canon. We don't know much more about John. Some historians believe he died of old age on the island of Patmos, where the book of Revelation was found and added to the Bible. Number 5. James the Lesser. Also known as James, son of Alphaeus, this second James was another apostle of Jesus. There is little definitively known about James. Experts believe he came from Nazareth, like Jesus, and also had a mother named Mary. Although some scholars believe James and Jesus were brothers, little evidence supports the idea. James, son of Alphaeus, is traditionally the author of the Book of James, a letter in the New Testament discussing Christian faith and wisdom. However, connecting this biblical text to James the Lesser is difficult because the letter does not specify which James wrote it. Several people named James participated in the early church. Traditionally, James, son of Alphaeus, was stoned to death around 62 CE as a martyr, leaving behind a letter and a collection of apocryphal works. Number 6. Philip. Philip was also one of the more prominent apostles, and the Bible contains more information about him than later apostles. He hailed from Bethsaida and appeared to have been a blue-collar common man, but he was also one of the apostles who worked with the Greek people. The Jewish and Greek people had different backgrounds and did not usually work together well. Philip appears to have served as a bridge between the two groups. He appears in the book of Acts, traveling to places like Samaria and Gaza. He is most famous for baptizing the Ethiopian eunuch. This eunuch was possibly the first non-Semitic person to receive the gospel, but it is the last mention of Philip in the Bible. Tradition states he wound up in Hierapolis, where he was martyred. Number 7. Bartholomew. Unlike previous apostles, there is almost no mention of Bartholomew in the New Testament. He appears on the lists of the disciples, but his actions are not recorded beyond that. Most historians think Bartholomew was Nathanael, who Philip brought to Jesus early on, but experts are still unsure. Whatever Bartholomew's real name was, he plays a role in the apocryphal writings, although many of his stories were fantastical, including secret knowledge about the destruction of the world and talking animals. Church tradition says Bartholomew was martyred by the Armenians around 68 CE, which involved being flayed alive. To this day, Bartholomew is remembered as the most tortured apostle. Number 8. Matthew. Matthew is famous for writing the Gospel of Matthew for Jewish believers. Some historians think he first wrote in Hebrew and Aramaic before translating to Greek. In his Gospel, Matthew notes he was a tax collector. People hated tax collectors because they usually took more than legally required and pocketed the profit. The Jewish people especially hated tax collectors because they worked for the Roman government, essentially turning their back on their Jewish faith. Despite his profession, Jesus invited him to become an apostle anyway. Sadly, no one knows what happened to Matthew after he wrote his gospel. He may have faded into history, but his legacy lives on. Although we only have one written work from Matthew, he dramatically impacted Christianity. He directly tied Jesus to the law of Moses, arguing that Jesus fulfilled the Jewish law and opened the way for all to embrace this new religion. Number 9. Thomas. Most famous as Doubting Thomas, Thomas is a crucial member of Jesus' apostles, even if most of his stories come from tradition or apocryphal stories. His most famous biblical moment comes after Jesus' crucifixion, when he heard Jesus had been resurrected. Thomas wanted to see Jesus physically before believing it. The idea of someone coming back from the dead was difficult to believe. Once Thomas saw Jesus' body, he believed and went on to help the other apostles spread the ideas of Christianity. There are 2 notable apocryphal books by Thomas called the Gospel of Thomas and the Acts of Thomas. Neither made it into the biblical canon. Tradition states Thomas went east to India, where he set up churches. He died of old age, although experts are divided on his final resting place. Number 10. Jude. Jude is one of the more obscure apostles, and historians even debate if Jude was his proper name. It is possible that Jude and Thaddeus are the same person. This person went on to write the book of Jude in the Bible. Sadly, this is all the information the Bible has on this apostle. Even his letter gives little information, not even providing a specific audience. Christian tradition offers a little more information. It states Jude was a Christian teacher working in places like Judea, Samaria, and Libya. He often traveled with Simon the Zealot, another apostle, and was eventually martyred around 65 CE. He was beaten to death in what is now Iran, allowing Jude to pass out of history as a traditional apostle. Number 11. Simon the Zealot. When Simon is mentioned, he is usually with Jude, so he suffers from many of the same problems. Historians also disagree on his name, although he is best known as Simon the Zealot. The Zealots were a branch of Judaism more focused on fundamentalism. While it is unlikely Simon turned away from following Jesus to become a zealot, this may be a reference to his enthusiasm for Christianity. Christian tradition says little about Simon, and even disagrees about how he died. Some say he died with Jude in Iran by being sawn in half, while others say he was tortured and crucified in Judea late in life, around 100 CE. This would have made Simon about 120 years old, so it's understandable why some question this story. Although Simon the Zealot may be relatively unknown, he is known as an enthusiastic apostle who traveled widely in his Christian evangelism. Number 12. Judas Iscariot. Although Judas Iscariot is one of the most famous apostles, his name is associated with evil. From the beginning of the Gospels, the writers note Judas was the one who betrayed Jesus, and there are no stories of Judas acting in a positive light. The Gospels were all written after the events, so the writers were set against him. Of course, for Christians, betraying Jesus earned Judas only shame and dishonor, and he has been a source of theological speculation for centuries. Judas Iscariot betrayed Jesus to the Jewish religious leaders for 30 pieces of silver, agreeing to work with them before the fateful night. However, Judas immediately felt guilty once he did and tried to give the money back. According to the Gospel of Matthew, when the religious leaders refused to take the money, Judas threw it at them and hanged himself in the field of blood. After this, Judas is not mentioned again in the Bible, even though his actions continue to influence Christian thought today. These 12 apostles were Jesus' inner circle, helping spread Christianity. 2 other apostles joined them after Jesus' ascension, Matthias and Paul. While we are still piecing together the stories of their lives, these apostles were essential to the start of Christianity, and their work continues to impact the world today.
So as you can see, there are a lot of really fascinating things coming out of those videos that tell you a little bit about each of these 12 apostles, the important disciples that followed Jesus. These are the early leaders, as they said in that last video, the inner circle for Jesus. These were the key people he leaned on to build the church, to go out and give the word, spread the word, assist him at big events, and really spread his word and his message to many, many more people than he could do himself. And also, of course, many of them lived many decades beyond Jesus. And so they carried on the word of the church and really kept building the church after Jesus died. So these were really, really important figures in early Christianity, very important historical figures, as you can see, evidence to their lives, both from the Bible and outside the Bible, as we mentioned. All of them had very interesting stories, interesting impacts, different personalities, came from different backgrounds, died in different ways. And then, of course, in the case of John, as the only one who survived to old age, he ended up writing the last book of the New Testament, which is, of course, Revelations. So really interesting stuff there. As you can see, hopefully you learned a lot about the 12 apostles, the ones who became saints, the disciples and the key disciples, individuals like Stephen, the women who followed Jesus, and then, of course, Paul, who became an apostle after the first 12. So really, really important individuals in history, as you can see. And we wanted to bring this to you tonight as an accompanying video to our earlier video we did on the history of Jesus. Take a look at that one. It was a pretty good set of research that we put together for you in that particular episode. Thank you so much for continuing to watch our channel, Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. We can't thank you enough for your patronage. Please drop us a comment on another episode you'd like us to do on the channel in the future. And we'll see you next time on an episode of Traveling Through History. Thanks for joining us. Hopefully you love history as much as we do.
Traveling through history, the show that uncovers the past mysteries. Washington, Jefferson, Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, or the independence of the state.